Pretty girls like you can't handle real medicine. That's what Dr. Hargrove said 6 months before everything changed. He didn't know she'd held the intestines of better men than him inside their bodies while mortar fire painted the walls red. He didn't know her hands had stopped trembling under pressure 2 decades ago. The room went dead silent when he made his bet in the staff lounge that morning. Katie Morrison would quit within a week, he announced, sliding a $500 bill across the break room table like he was calling a bluff. Nobody knew they were looking at a decorated combat medic. Nobody knew the woman arranging 4 bags with surgical precision was someone the Pentagon had officially erased from existence. 3 days later, a John Doe arrived at Sacred Heart's trauma bay with no wallet, no phone, and a tattoo that stopped Katie's heart. Katie Morrison moved through the ER hallways of Sacred Heart like water, quiet, purposeful, occupying space without demanding it. 6 months as a registered nurse in civilian life, and she had perfected the art of being unremarkable. Her scrubs were always navy blue, never the patterned ones other nurses wore. Her name badge hung at the precise angle of deference. She kept her eyes down when doctors entered rooms, spoke only when asked a direct question, and completed every task with the kind of steady competence that made her invisible. Invisible was safer. Invisible meant no one asked questions about the surgical scars on her knuckles or the faint outline she kept hidden every morning beneath layers of foundation, an anchor crossed with cormorant wings, tattooed in 2001, officially never existing. The ER at Sacred Heart ran like any hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. Fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that made most people's eyes water within an hour. Katie didn't notice anymore. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from Bay 3. Monitors beeped in polyrhythmic syncopation, each patient a separate soundtrack, overlapping, creating a kind of organized chaos that made sense only to people trained to decode it. Katie had been trained by the United States Navy to decode far worse than this. She had been trained as a senior chief petty officer to keep people alive when the ground itself was trying to kill them. What she did in the ER now was, by comparison, almost mundane. She organized supply carts with military precision. She changed dressings with hands that never wavered. She started peripheral fours with a single smooth motion 18-gauge needle finding the vein on first attempt every time. The other nurses complained about how she arranged things too orderly, they said. One of them, Jamie, had actually rearranged the crash cart once because Katie's system made her uncomfortable. Jamie worked in labor and delivery now. Some people sensed the order beneath the quiet and decided they preferred chaos. In the break room, Katie kept a dying succulent on the windowsill that no one had watered in 3 weeks and a cracked NASA mug that read "Houston, we have a problem" in faded blue letters. She drank her coffee black, 2 cups, always at 6:11 a.m. before her shift began. She didn't socialize. She didn't attend the monthly happy hour. She didn't participate in the Secret Santa exchange. She existed at Sacred Heart as a professional absence, present but not truly there, helpful but not memorable. Her hands never shook during procedures, but they trembled slightly when Dr. Hargrove entered a room, not from fear but from the muscular effort of staying absolutely, deliberately still. Dr. James Hargrove was the kind of man who believed his title was a personality. He was a senior emergency physician with a wife who served on 3 charity boards and a brother-in-law who was a state senator. He had money that predated his earning it and confidence that no amount of failure could erode. He moved through Sacred Heart's hallways with the presumption of belonging, the way men move when the world has always bent toward their preferences. His voice carried the particular tone of someone accustomed to being listened to without actually saying anything important. That morning in the staff lounge, he had called a meeting. No particular reason. Just wanted to address the new nurses, he'd said. Katie was refilling the coffee pot when he arrived. She kept her eyes on the dark liquid streaming into the carafe and her shoulders positioned at an angle of minimal presence. "We've been discussing the retention rates among new female staff," Hargrove announced, his tone already amused. "Curious trend. The pretty ones quit first." Jamie laughed. One of the male nurses, Derek, shifted uncomfortably. "The physically attractive candidates," Hargrove continued, warming to his thesis, "they tend to believe the job is less demanding than it actually is. They're accustomed to easier paths. So they arrive with this notion that an ER will be manageable, and then they encounter real medicine, and they crumble. He turned to look directly at Katie. His eyes moved down her body in a way that made her want to request a transfer, request a different floor, request anything that would mean not seeing his face again. But she stayed still. Still hands. Still face. Still breath. "I'm actually making a bet," he said, pulling 5 $100 bills from his wallet and placing them on the counter with ceremony. "This particular nurse, Katie, will be gone within a week. Maybe 2, maximum." Katie continued pouring coffee. The carafe made a soft clicking sound as she set it down. "You've got nice hands, Katie," Hargrove said, like it was a compliment. "Steady hands. But you'll see. Pretty girls with nice hands don't last in real medicine." No one said anything. Katie turned to face him, still holding the coffee pot. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. Then she poured herself a cup, set the pot back down, and walked out. Not a word. Not a single word. That was the kind of power Hargrove didn't understand, the power of someone with nothing left to prove. She was on trauma call 3 days later when the radio crackled at 2:17 a.m. "Sacred Heart, incoming vehicular accident, ETA for minutes. Male, unknown age, unconscious, significant head trauma, possible internal injuries. Level 1. The team was ready. Katie positioned herself at the trauma bay entrance, her mind already running through the differential diagnosis, the potential complications, the equipment they might need. She'd done this thousands of times. She'd done this in conditions that would have broken most civilian ER nurses into pieces. The ambulance arrived with the usual controlled urgency. Paramedics wheeled the stretcher in, a man in his mid-30s, pale skin, closed eyes, facial lacerations across his left cheekbone and forehead. No identification anywhere. His pockets were empty. His wallet was gone, possibly at the scene. Pedestrian versus sedan, the paramedic said. Hit and run. Found him 2 blocks from the accident site. No witnesses. They transferred him to the trauma bay with the kind of choreographed efficiency that came from repetition. Dr. Hargrove was already there, already issuing orders. Katie moved into position, beginning the standard assessment. Vital signs. Pupil response. The 12-lead EKG. She reached for his shirt to place the leads, cutting away the fabric with trauma shears, her trauma shears, actually, the ones with her initials etched into the handles decades ago, a habit she couldn't break even in civilian life. The fabric came away in pieces. His chest was lean, muscular, the kind of physical conditioning that came from something more than a gym membership. And then she saw it. The tattoo on his left shoulder. Black ink. A 75th Ranger Regiment scroll in the unmistakable unit design. Katie's hands froze for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was nothing in trauma time. 3 seconds was everything. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The odds of the specific person she'd been trying not to think about for 20 years, the child she'd saved in Tikrit in 2004, the boy she'd given her own blood to, landing in her ER on a Tuesday night at 2:17 a.m., the odds were astronomical. But the tattoo was real. She could see it. And when she looked at his face in profile, at the particular shape of his jaw and the angle of his cheekbone, at the features she'd held in her mind as a child's face and now had to reconcile with a man's, she knew. Her breath caught. She forced it steady, forced her hands to continue their work, placed the EKG leads with movements that came from muscle memory because her conscious mind had just shattered into 20 years of operational compartmentalization. The monitors came alive with data. Heart rate elevated. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation adequate but declining. Hargrove was shouting orders. Nobody noticed that Katie's hands had stopped moving for those 3 seconds. Nobody noticed that her eyes had locked on the tattoo with an intensity that suggested she was reading her own death sentence written in black ink on a stranger's shoulder. What they didn't know was that Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse. She was a legend who'd been buried. She was someone who'd held a terrified child while his femoral artery painted the ground red and said, "You're safe now," in a voice steady enough to rewrite his entire future. She was someone whose military rank had been officially erased from every system on Earth. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent hum when Katie pushed through the double doors at 6:44 a.m., searching for something, anything, to make the shift ahead feel survivable. Dr. Hargrove was already there, holding court like a general addressing his battalion. For other physicians circled him. 2 administrators. Gerald Westbrook, the board chairman himself, nursing a cup of something expensive. They were laughing at something Hargrove had said, the kind of laughter that required an audience to feel real. He looked up as she entered. His eyes found her the way a predator's eyes find movement in tall grass. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Gentlemen, I'm making a public prediction." He set down his coffee cup with theatrical precision. "Our little Katie here won't last the week. $100 says she quits by Friday. Pretty girls like you can't handle real medicine, sweetheart. This isn't playing nurse at summer camp." The room crystallized into silence. Westbrook's smile faltered slightly, even he seemed to sense the line had moved. One of the cardiologists cleared his throat, suddenly interested in his phone. But Hargrove held her gaze, waiting for the response he'd scripted in his mind: tears, an apology, maybe a stammered defense that would prove his point. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath trained into muscle memory across 12 years, 3 continents, and 47 documented combat saves. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, not from shame, but from the precise physiological response of a human body under controlled stress. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of still water, something that appeared calm on the surface but could drown you if you weren't careful. "I've held the intestines of better men than you'll ever be inside their bodies while under mortar fire." She poured her coffee. The carafe hissed softly as the dark liquid hit the ceramic mug. Then she turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing in their aluminum housings, a sound like static between stations on a radio no one was listening to anymore. Hargrove's face darkened. Not the flush of anger, but the shade of something deeper, the realization that his authority had been publicly challenged, that a woman he'd categorized as disposable had just revealed a spine made of something harder than his entire institutional power structure. She wasn't supposed to have been anyone. She was supposed to break. What he didn't know, what none of them could know, was that Katie Morrison had stood in far worse rooms, rooms that smelled like diesel exhaust and cordite and dust that tasted like copper, and been the only person in them trained to save lives when everything else was trying to end them. But Hargrove had no framework for understanding that. So he did what powerful mediocre men always do: he activated his network. The next day, the cafeteria was packed. It was 12:34 p.m., the peak hour when the entire hospital converged to eat simultaneously, a sea of scrubs and white coats and the administrative staff who moved through those hallways like sharks sensing blood in the water. Katie carried her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, apple, yogurt, past the doctor's table where Hargrove sat with 3 residents. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that comes from navigating tight spaces in worse circumstances, through rubble, through chaos, through places where one wrong step meant your team didn't come home. Hargrove accidentally bumped her arm as she passed. The tray went down with a sound like failure, the sharp crack of ceramic breaking, pasta sauce exploding across white tile, the clatter of silverware echoing off the cafeteria walls like applause for his cruelty. 60 people turned to stare. The cafeteria held its breath. This was the moment. This was where he expected her to crumble. Katie knelt without hesitation, gathering broken dishes with steady hands. Not trembling. Not defensive. Just methodical, the way someone collects the pieces of something broken because that's what needs to happen next. "Oh, how clumsy," Hargrove said loudly, his voice carrying across the shocked silence. "Maybe you should stick to bedpans, Katie cakes. It's more your speed." She looked up from the scattered pasta. Met his eyes from a kneeling position that should have made her smaller but somehow made her larger. I've cleaned up worse messes in places you'd need a map to find. She said it matter-of-factly. Not a comeback. A statement of fact. As if she were simply confirming that water was wet, that gravity worked, that some people had survived things that would have rewritten their entire understanding of what the human body could endure. The cafeteria remained silent. Even the residents at Hargrove's table had gone very still, the way animals go still when they sense the presence of something apex in the room. That afternoon, Katie was restocking the supply cart at the nurse's station when Hargrove cornered her. No audience yet, but he was building toward one. He threw a patient chart at her feet, paper scattering across the polished floor like snow. His voice was controlled, which somehow made it worse than yelling. Pick that up, sweetheart. Consider it practice for your real career level. 3 nurses witnessed it. Katie saw them from her peripheral vision, saw the way their eyes widened, not quite ready to say anything, but registering the moment as transgression. She crouched, gathered each page with deliberate calm, reassembled them in proper sequence, and handed Hargrove the chart perfectly reorganized. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. She'd learned steadiness in a place where the walls were collapsing and children were screaming, and the only thing between catastrophe and survival was the ability to move without hesitation. Is there anything else, doctor? He had no response because her composure was the worst possible answer to his aggression. She was supposed to get angry, to cry, to defend herself. Any of those responses would have validated his narrative that she didn't belong. Instead, she'd simply absorbed his cruelty and remained unchanged, which somehow felt like an indictment against him rather than her. That evening, Hargrove made phone calls. The first was to Board Chairman Westbrook, who owed him for the time he'd covered up his nephew's prescription fraud problem before it could reach the medical board. The second was to Hospital Administrator Patricia Hoffman with carefully worded concerns, employment gaps, evasive background information, credentials that seemed inconsistent with her history. By 9 p.m., he'd contacted someone named Hoffman from outside, an HR investigator who specialized in building airtight termination cases, the kind of person who could make someone disappear from a system with paperwork and protocols. He was also activating his most dangerous asset, doubt. He was planting questions in the minds of people with institutional power, and questions, once planted, grow roots. Meanwhile, Katie sat beside the John Doe's bed in the ICU during her lunch break on Thursday. The monitors tracked his vital signs with the steady beeping rhythm of someone still tethered to life, still fighting even unconscious. She studied his face, the bone structure different from what she remembered, matured into manhood, but the scar tissue through his right eyebrow was identical. She remembered exactly how he got it. She'd been holding him in the rubble when the secondary collapse happened, when another section of wall came down and sliced open his forehead, and she'd pressed her own hand against it and said the only thing that mattered, "You're safe now." His chart indicated approximately 27 years old. That fit. The muscle definition in his shoulders and arms, the scarring patterns on his hands, the way even in sedation his breathing was controlled and tactical, active military, recent. But his belongings bag contained something that made her hand start to shake. A pair of combat boots. Not current issue. Ancient. The leather cracked and faded, the laces knotted in a way that suggested they'd been tied the same way for years. The kind of thing someone kept because it meant survival. The kind of thing you didn't throw away. She gripped the bed rail and forced her breathing to remain even. 12 years of training in compartmentalization, and it was all threatening to fracture right now, in this moment, in this room where she was supposed to be invisible. That evening, nurse practitioner Williams mentioned casually that Dr. Hargrove had been asking questions about Katie's patient assignments and spending unusual amounts of time reviewing her documentation. She'd found a formal written warning in her mailbox citing excessive time spent with non-assigned patients. She was being monitored. Tracked. The machinery of institutional power was starting to move against her, slowly at first, then with increasing velocity. The John Doe's status changed just before shift change. His vitals shifted from stable to guarded. His blood pressure drifting. His oxygen saturation beginning its slow, inexorable decline. The monitors tracked his deterioration with mathematical indifference, and Katie stood at his bedside knowing something that no one else in the hospital knew, that this man was connected to her past, that his presence was a thread connected to everything she'd spent 20 years trying to bury, and that she was running out of time to figure out who he was before the system consumed her entirely. The chart told a story that Hargrove couldn't read. Katie stood in the ICU at 11:27 p.m. on the third night, 2 hours into her shift, staring at the monitor strips taped to the patient's bedside documentation. Central venous pressure climbing. Blood pressure descending. O2 saturation trending downward in a pattern that moved like a predator stalking wounded prey. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in shades of institutional white, and she could smell the particular blend of this wing, antiseptic layered over something metallic, something like copper pennies dissolving on a tongue. 3 days. The John Doe had been unconscious for exactly 72 hours and 14 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting. She pulled the stat echocardiogram results from the printer, and the image confirmed what her 23 years of medical experience already knew: fluid in the pericardial sac. Not a small amount. Enough to compress the heart's right atrium, enough to restrict filling, enough to kill him if the pressure continued climbing. Cardiac tamponade wasn't a diagnosis you watched and waited on. It was a diagnosis that demanded intervention in the next few hours, maybe less. The numbers didn't lie. CVP at 18. BP 94/62. The trajectory was mathematical. The outcome was inevitable without treatment. She picked up the bedside phone and paged Dr. Hargrove. 32 minutes later, he arrived smelling like expensive cologne and the particular kind of irritation that came from being pulled away from something he considered more important. He wore a charcoal suit even at midnight, the kind of garment that existed to announce status. He glanced at the echocardiogram image for approximately 4 seconds, not long enough to actually absorb it, long enough to perform the appearance of review, and turned away with the kind of dismissive exhale that doctors deployed like weapons. "Observation," he said. "We'll repeat in the morning." The body often reabsorbs small pericardial effusions on its own. Katie's hands were steady. Her voice came out the same way it had when she'd been ordering Navy corpsmen to stop bleeding out soldiers, quiet, even, containing no room for negotiation. His pressure is dropping and his CVP is elevated. This isn't observation. He needs a pericardiocentesis. He needs it now. Hargrove stepped closer. The invasion of space was deliberate. His eyes narrowed the way a predator's might when sensing a challenge to its territory. You don't make treatment decisions, Nurse Morrison. You execute them. There's a difference, and it seems you've forgotten which side of that line you stand on. His heart's being compressed, Katie said. In 4 hours he'll be in arrest. Then we'll treat arrest if it occurs. Hargrove pulled out his phone, typed something with the deliberateness of someone making a statement, and looked up at her with the kind of smile that looked nothing like kindness. "I'm reassigning you. Get off this floor. Send someone competent." He wrote the order himself, there in the patient's chart, using the electronic system to lock Katie out of the ICU patient list. Reassignment to pediatrics effective immediately. She watched him work, watched the keyboard click seal her distance from the man with the 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo, and felt something ancient and dangerous move beneath her skin like a submarine rising to periscope depth. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply nodded and walked to the stairwell. The locker room was empty at 11:53 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The fluorescent lights hummed their particular song of institutional fluorescence, and Katie stood in front of the mirror above the sink, really looked at herself. She saw the scrubs. She saw the ID badge clipped to her pocket. She saw the dark circles under her eyes that came from 3 nights of checking monitors from 4 floors away, 3 nights of asking the ICU nurses if he'd woken up, 3 nights of hearing nothing but silence and the ambient electronic beeping of a patient descending. But underneath that image, reflected in the mirror like a ghost, was someone else. Someone with her jaw but harder. Someone with her eyes but emptier of mercy. Senior Chief Petty Officer Kate Morrison. Reaper. The woman who'd held a child's intestines inside his body while bullets punched holes in a wall 6 inches from her head. The woman who'd given her own blood to keep that child conscious. The woman who'd been erased from every record, every roster, every official acknowledgement of existence because a mission had gone sideways and needed to disappear completely. That woman stared back at her now. At 1:33 a.m., the pediatric floor clerk's voice crackled over the radio, cardiac monitor alarming, ICU bed 7. Katie was in the children's wing, 60 feet from the stairwell. She'd changed assignments. She'd been explicitly ordered away. Hargrove had positioned himself as the attending physician of record, which meant he controlled whether any intervention happened at all, and he'd made it clear that his pride mattered more than the patient's survival. She was 4 floors away. The distance stretched like a chasm. She thought about those worn combat boots in the belongings bag. She thought about a terrified child's eyes when she'd said "you're safe now" in a language she'd learned from a private instructor in Camp Lejeune. She thought about the fact that warriors who survived became something different, harder, heavier, marked by carrying weight that civilians never learned existed. She thought about what a senior chief petty officer did when she saw a soldier dying. The stairwell door was 15 feet from where she stood. She could hear the monitor alarming from upstairs, transmitted through the hospital's intercommunication system, a sound like a siren that meant catastrophic failure. She could feel the institutional machinery already moving toward her termination. She'd felt Hargrove's calculation, knew his network was already activating, understood that challenging the hierarchy was a death sentence for anyone without the armor of credentials he possessed. Going upstairs meant the end of everything she'd built at Sacred Heart. It meant a cardboard box with the photo of her lost team. It meant the rain-soaked bus stop waiting like a destination already written. Not going upstairs meant a ranger died because a department head's ego mattered more than protocol. Katie moved. Her legs remembered the acceleration that had carried her through Tikrit's rubble. Her hands remembered exactly what they needed to do. She took the stairs 3 at a time, muscle memory making the decisions now, her body executing a code written so deep into her nervous system that it didn't require conscious thought. The stairwell echoed with her boots, rubber soles on concrete, a sound like rain on metal roofing. Up. 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 The monitor's alarm grew louder with each flight. The air itself seemed to change, to pressure compress like the atmosphere before a detonation. She hit the ICU floor at a run, and the room that had been denied to her 40 minutes earlier spread before her like an invitation she'd never been given permission to accept. The monitor showed what she already knew, pericardial pressure compressing the heart's function, oxygen saturation at 67 and falling, blood pressure collapsing like a structure with its foundation removed. Hargrove wasn't at the bedside. The ICU nurse, a competent woman named Martinez who'd worked under Katie before, looked up with an expression that contained both relief and something like terror at what this moment meant. "What are you doing here?" Martinez said. "Getting you a tray," Katie replied. 18-gauge needle, sterile field, position him upright at 45 degrees. "I need that echocardiogram machine moved to the bedside." It wasn't a request. It was a command in the exact tone that made corpsmen move, that made young soldiers understand they were about to survive something. Martinez moved. The nurse's aide moved. Someone got the equipment. Katie's hands were already moving, already remembering the precise location where the needle needed to enter, the 5th intercostal space at the mid-axillary line, straight through the pericardium into the accumulated fluid that was suffocating the heart. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Kate Morrison now, and the work she'd been buried to forget was the work she'd never actually stopped knowing how to do. The needle went in. The fluid came out. Fluid that had been translucent and lethal began draining into the collection syringe with a sound like the world exhaling. The monitor responded immediately, CVP dropping, oxygen saturation climbing, blood pressure ascending back toward something compatible with consciousness. 75, 82. 88, the numbers moved like they were supposed to, like the body understood it had been given a second chance. Katie didn't celebrate. She didn't speak. She withdrew the needle, disposed of it properly, and turned to find Hargrove standing in the doorway with an expression that made even rage look small by comparison. "You've exceeded your scope of practice," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Katie met his eyes. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say to a man who'd made his choice so completely. She looked at the monitor one more time, still climbing, still stable, and then she walked toward the elevator, toward the exit, toward the cardboard box and the rain and the bus stop that had been waiting for her since the moment she'd given blood to a child she couldn't save, a child who'd just been saved anyway. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was walking toward her ending, and she didn't know yet that the child was about to wake up. She didn't know that a voice was about to speak a single word that would change everything she'd become in 20 years of hiding. She didn't know that the person she'd erased was about to become the only person in the room who mattered. She only knew that she'd done what a senior chief petty officer did, she'd saved the soldier. And she'd known the cost of it. The chart told a story if you knew how to read it. 3 days had passed since the John Doe arrived at Sacred Heart, 3 days of Katie watching his central venous pressure climb like a slow-motion avalanche while his blood pressure trended the opposite direction, the two numbers heading toward each other like doomed trains on the same track. She stood at the night shift station at 1:22 a.m., reading numbers that said something was filling the space around his heart. Not infection. Not inflammation. Blood. His own blood, accumulating where it didn't belong, strangling the organ that kept him alive. The monitor's alarm shrieked at 1:52 a.m. One sound. A single electronic wail that cut through the quiet ICU like a siren through fog. Katie's head snapped up before the second pulse of the alarm finished its cry. The John Doe's pressure was collapsing, 60/40 and falling, numbers plummeting like a bird with clipped wings. His heart rate compensated, climbing toward 140, then 150, a desperate gallop that bought seconds but no more. The night resident, Dr. Marcus Chen, stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something he understood. "Pericardial tamponade," Katie said. Not a question. Not a request. A diagnosis stated with the certainty of someone who'd seen this before, who'd held pressure on wounds while bullets painted the air and watched organs fail under the weight of their own blood. She was already moving, already reaching for the ultrasound machine with hands that didn't shake, that had learned long ago that panic was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. "Get me an 18-gauge needle. Betadine. And step back." Chen's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "We need to call the attending." "We can't. He's in cardiac arrest in 3 minutes if we wait." Katie's voice was flat, conversational, the voice of someone commenting on the weather. She positioned the ultrasound probe at the subxiphoid area, the narrow triangle of skin below the sternum where the needle could slip through tissue and reach the sac surrounding his heart. The ultrasound screen bloomed with gray shapes, chambers, and fluid, and there it was, a dark crescent of accumulated blood, compressing the right atrium like a hand slowly closing around a throat. The night nurse, Patterson, new hire, sharp eyes, already had the betadine swab in motion. She understood. She'd worked enough shifts with Katie to recognize the voice of someone who'd given orders before, someone whose certainty was a kind of gravity that made other people move. Katie prepped the skin with brisk efficiency, the betadine spreading in an amber arc, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the recycled hospital air. She picked up the needle, 18 gauge, long enough, the kind of thing that looked fragile until you understood what it could do. The door burst open. Dr. Hargrove materialized in the doorway like a storm cloud taking shape, his white coat flaring, his face already flushed with the particular rage of a man being proven irrelevant. "Stop," he commanded, his voice loud enough to carry the weight of authority, loud enough to make Chen flinch. "Step away from that patient immediately. You are exceeding your scope of practice. This is grounds for immediate termination." Katie didn't look up. The needle advanced at a 30-degree angle, guided by the ultrasound image on the screen, the tip heading toward the dark fluid with the precision of a surgeon placing a suture. She could feel Hargrove's attention like heat on the back of her neck, his presence filling the ICU bay, his outrage crystallizing into words that were meant to stop her, to break her composure, to fracture her certainty. "He'll live now," Katie said quietly, advancing the needle through tissue and membrane and into the space where death was accumulating in the form of blood. "You can fire me after." The needle sank deeper. Her hand was steady as a surgical laser. Her breath came in the measured rhythm of someone who'd done this before while explosions thundered outside, and she had to keep the patient alive with fingers and focus and the absolute refusal to fail. The monitor showed her everything: the needle's trajectory, the fluid surrounding the heart, the chambers being crushed by pressure and physics, and the body's own blood turned against itself. Then she felt it. The give. The entrance into the pericardial sac. She connected the syringe. Drew back on the plunger. 200 milliliters of blood pulled into the syringe in 3 long seconds. Dark, already beginning to clot, the body's desperate attempt to seal a wound that shouldn't exist. She could hear Hargrove shouting now, something about security, something about protocol, but his words had become background noise, static beneath the work. The monitor changed. The heart, no longer strangled, began to pump with purpose again. The blood pressure that had been falling like a stone reversed its trajectory, 70/50. Then 85/60. Then 105/70. The John Doe's oxygen saturation climbed from 88 to 92 to 96. His heart rate dropped from 155 to 130 to 110, the desperate gallop settling into something almost sustainable, almost human. Katie withdrew the needle, applied pressure with sterile gauze, and looked at the monitor one more time. Sinus rhythm. Strong. Alive. "Get a chest X-ray," she said to Patterson. "And continuous monitoring. His pressure's stable for now, but watch for any signs of reaccumulation." She peeled off her gloves with precise movements, one finger at a time, the latex whispering as it came free. Only then did she turn to face Hargrove, who was already on his phone, his face the color of spilled wine, his voice sharp and furious as he demanded security respond to the ICU immediately. The rain came that afternoon, the kind of rain that felt personal, that felt like judgment. By 6 o'clock, Katie sat across from Patricia Hoffman, the HR director, in an office that smelled of coffee and furniture polish and the particular staleness that comes from spaces where difficult conversations happen. Hargrove sat beside her like a lawyer with a prosecution, and he'd brought evidence, a file thick with documentation he must have assembled while she saved a life, while she chose action over hesitation, while she did what a senior chief petty officer did when someone was dying. "Performance concerns," Hoffman said, reading from the file without meeting Katie's eyes. "Unauthorized procedures. Insubordination. Violation of direct orders." Katie said nothing. Silence was sometimes the only honest response. Effective immediately, Hoffman continued, "Sacred Heart is terminating your employment. There will be a notation in your file regarding scope of practice violations. That notation will follow your nursing license." Katie stood. Nodded. Walked out. By 4 p.m., she stood at a bus stop 3 blocks from Sacred Heart, rain soaking through a cardboard box that held everything she'd earned in 6 months of invisibility, a cracked NASA mug from the break room, a dying succulent she'd tried to keep alive, and a photo from Tikrit 2004. Her and her fire team, for soldiers in desert camo with their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling like people who didn't know yet that someday they wouldn't all be smiling anymore. 3 of them never left that desert. Their families received folded flags and thank you letters from generals. Katie Morrison, officially, had never existed. The water soaked through the cardboard bottom, and she watched it happen with the detached awareness of someone watching their own life become debris. She had nowhere to go. She couldn't contact her old command because she'd been erased, deleted from every system, her service record classified so deep that the government had spent 20 years pretending she'd never carried a weapon or saved a life or learned to move through the world like a ghost. She'd had a new identity, a new name, a new existence as an invisible nurse in an anonymous city. Until the John Doe with the Ranger tattoo arrived and broke every rule she'd made about staying hidden. She turned around at 6:41 p.m. and walked back towards Sacred Heart, the rain cold against her face. She still had a visitor badge from when she'd clocked out. Still had access to the building for another hour before security would realize she was fired and revoke her credentials. She needed to say goodbye. She needed to see him one more time before she disappeared again, before she found some other city, some other hospital, some other way to be invisible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was walking into the ICU and approaching his bed and leaning close to whisper, "You're going to be fine, warrior. Stay strong." The worst part was his eyes fluttering open, brown eyes she'd recognized the first moment she saw him unconscious, eyes like a terrified child's that she'd looked into in 2004 when she was giving him her blood and promising he'd be safe. The worst part was hearing his voice, deeper now but carrying the same weight, whisper a single word that stopped her heart completely. "Reaper." His grown voice was different but his eyes were the same as that terrified child's when she'd said, "You're safe now," and he spoke clearly, the words coming like a salute, "Senior Chief." Katie's hands began to tremble on the bed rail, not from fear but from the collision of two worlds she'd spent 20 years keeping apart. 20 years of being nobody. 20 years of burying Kate Morrison, Senior Chief Petty Officer, in a grave marked only by silence and erasure. And now this man, this warrior, had pulled her out of it with two words spoken in the darkness of an ICU at 3 in the morning. She couldn't speak. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from holding 17 years of impossible things in your chest and suddenly being allowed to put them down. Omar's eyes locked onto hers and he reached for her hand with the same movement he'd made in that rubble outside Tikrit, the same reaching toward someone who'd already proven she would not let him fall. "You found me," he whispered. "You found me," Katie said back, and her voice carried the weight of a woman stepping out of a mask she'd worn so long it had calcified into skin. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hargrove. By morning, the hospital board's decision had already traveled through Sacred Heart like a shock wave. Katie Morrison was reinstated. Back pay. Full apology. And something worse, something that turned his entire world into fractured glass, promotion. A new veterans trauma program, reporting directly to board chairman Westbrook, with authority that made her suddenly untouchable. Westbrook had looked at Hargrove across that conference table with the expression of a man watching a chess piece realize it had never been playing chess at all. "We'll discuss your conduct tomorrow morning, Dr. Hargrove," he said, and those 8 words contained the sound of a career collapsing like a building imploding inward. Hargrove left the conference room and his hands shook as he gripped the stairwell railing. Suspended. Under investigation. His medical privileges revoked pending inquiry. 3 other nurses had come forward by noon, other incidents, other intimidations, other moments he'd thought buried. But they were all secondary to the one thing that mattered, the footage. He needed the footage gone. At 11:17 p.m., Hargrove returned to Sacred Heart alone. The parking lot was empty. His security badge still worked, they hadn't deactivated it yet. The IT office was on the 3rd floor, a small climate-controlled room humming with the sound of servers, and Hargrove knew the password because he'd watched Patricia Hoffman enter it 100 times. The security system interface opened, and there it was, 2 weeks of archived footage from the cafeteria, the nurse's station, the ICU. The tray incident. The chart thrown at Katie's feet. The confrontation during the emergency procedure. All of it crystallized into digital evidence. All of it damning. He clicked delete on the first file. Then the second. Then the third. Muscle memory took over. He was efficient, methodical, the same precision he brought to patient files and hospital politics. 5 minutes. 7 deleted files. The evidence dissolving like he'd never done it at all. What Hargrove didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Marcus Webb, Sacred Heart's IT administrator and a former Marine Corps sergeant who'd spent for years in communications intelligence before he came back stateside, had flagged Hargrove's security access 3 months ago. Webb had watched the behavioral pattern escalate, late-night login attempts, unusual access requests, the hallmarks of a man preparing to cover his tracks. Webb had already backed up every frame to an external drive kept in a locked drawer under his desk. He'd been waiting. When Hargrove deleted the 7th file, an automated alert pinged on Webb's personal phone at 11:34 p.m. Deletion attempts. Timestamps. The exact files removed. Webb was awake, had been awake, actually, reading a report on the hospital's new security protocols, and he pulled on his jacket and drove back to Sacred Heart in 8 minutes. He found Hargrove still in the server room, staring at the empty desktop as if the footage might reconstitute itself through sheer will. "Step away from the terminal," Webb said, and his voice had the flatline quality of a man who'd already made his decision. Slowly. Hargrove turned and saw the former Marine's face, saw that he'd been caught not by technology or luck but by someone who knew exactly how to wait for a predator to expose itself. "I was just," Hargrove started. "Documenting evidence tampering." Webb pulled his phone up. "Already recording. Already calling the hospital legal office. And the North Carolina Medical Board. You just committed a felony, doctor. Congratulations." By dawn, Patricia Hoffman was turning over every email, every call log, every document showing Hargrove's coordination with board members. The scheme that had seemed so elegant in the planning, board connections activated, false performance concerns manufactured, Katie's employment history mischaracterized, suddenly looked like what it was: deliberate institutional sabotage orchestrated by a man trying to destroy someone who'd challenged his authority. The North Carolina Medical Board opened formal disciplinary proceedings. Board Chairman Westbrook convened an emergency session and presented the security footage in a private hearing. Hargrove's lawyer sat beside him as the video played, the moment in the cafeteria, the chart thrown like a weapon, his voice raised while Katie performed a life-saving procedure with steady hands. No context made it look better. No explanation made it acceptable. His medical privileges were suspended pending investigation. His position at Sacred Heart was terminated effective immediately. 3 other nurses provided additional testimony about patterns of intimidation spanning years, moments Hargrove had thought forgotten, incidents he'd convinced himself were minor, all of it now coming forward because Katie Morrison's vindication had given them permission to speak. The board members who'd owed him favor suddenly had better things to do. Phone calls went unreturned. Offers of support evaporated like rain on hot asphalt. By afternoon, Hargrove was sitting in his lawyer's office realizing that the institutional protection he'd counted on for 20 years had been contingent on him never being exposed. He'd been exposed. 6 months later, Katie Morrison stood in a bright office overlooking Sacred Heart's Memorial Garden, her Navy Cross mounted on the wall beside her 3 Purple Hearts and her nursing credentials. The Veterans Trauma Program was live. For nurse practitioners reported to her. Monthly PTSD support groups ran in the basement conference room, facilitated by Katie herself, her classified experience now transformed into healing. Army Ranger Omar Hashim, fully recovered, stood beside her for the program's ribbon-cutting ceremony. He wore his dress uniform and moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd relearned how to trust his own body. He presented her with a framed photograph, 7-year-old Omar in a hospital bed, wearing boots 5 sizes too big, grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd just been told he was going to live. Those same boots, cleaned, preserved, placed inside a glass case, sat in Katie's office with a plaque beneath them: "What we save, saves us." "You kept them," Katie said, touching the glass. 20 years, Omar replied. "You told me to remember their size. You told me to focus on the weight, on something real, something I could feel when the pain got too loud. I stood in those boots every morning in basic training. I thought about the woman in the hospital who'd saved my life. Every single day, I knew I had to become someone worthy of that." Katie's eyes closed for a moment. The mask had come off completely now. Senior Chief Petty Officer Kate Morrison stood fully visible, her Navy record restored, her classified operations declassified by the Pentagon once Omar's identity became public knowledge. The woman who'd vanished in 2004 had been officially UN disappeared, her service reinstated, her honor restored. At the Raleigh Farmers Market that Saturday, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table beside stacks of brochures for supplemental insurance policies. His medical license was suspended for 3 years minimum. His hospital career was finished. His professional reputation, documented in security footage and board minutes, had been reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when a man tries to destroy someone stronger than he understands. Families walked past without looking at him. A child asked his mother what the sad man was selling. The mother pulled him along. That afternoon, Katie met Omar and his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Torres, for coffee at a place downtown with wide windows and the smell of espresso thick enough to taste. Omar asked if she ever regretted staying quiet for so long, staying invisible, letting the world think she was just a nurse. Katie touched the glass case in her mind, those boots that had contained a child's survival for 20 years. I was ordered to disappear. But some things, some people, they're worth surfacing for. Some lives, you don't get to let go of. Not ever. She looked out the window at the city beyond, at the streets where veterans walked and bled and tried to find their way back to solid ground. She thought about the ICU, about the emergency department where new nurses rushed between traumas, where veterans arrived seeking someone who understood, seeking hands that had held what they had held. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated or if you know someone carrying a secret that could change everything, subscribe, like, and comment below. Tell us, what would you have done in Katie's position?